Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Zembler Miller.
In this episode, we'll discuss anti Semitism in the government of British Columbia in Canada. Our guest served as Minister of Post-Secondary Education until February of 2024, when she was forced to resign over remarks she made that were deemed offensive to Palestinians. Since then, she has also decided to quit the caucus of the ruling New Democratic Party in this Canadian province. Selina Robinson, who is Jewish, will discuss the indifference to anti Semitism that she is experiencing, including among her colleagues in the left wing New Democratic Party. Selina, thank you for coming on our show. We're honored and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Evelyn. Thank you for having me, Phyllis.
Let's get right into it. So can you tell us about your speech of January 30th that started this whole sequence of events?
Sure, certainly. So in January, I was asked to speak to B'nai B'rith on a B'nai B'rith panel on anti-Semitism. B'nai B'rith here in Canada is seen as I guess, a conservative activist organization. And yes, I'm a progressive, but I also feel like it's important as a Jewish elected person to speak wherever I can about anti-Semitism and how it's playing out, certainly since October 7th. Here in British Columbia, which is the west coast of Canada. And all the other panelists were from the East Coast. We call the Toronto, Montreal area the coast. It's really not a coast, but we call it the East Coast. And they were all men. So I felt like, okay, they need a woman, they need someone from the West on their panel. And so I spoke, and I did mention, I will say this, as I was the last person to speak, and I was squished for time on the panel. And I spoke very quickly about how anti-Semitism was presenting itself, that we have data that says 18 to 34-year-olds don't understand the history of the Holocaust. They don't understand the history of the founding of Israel as a state in that context. And I did say that, go figure, that the Jews got what was considered a crappy piece of land, that really did not have a strong economy, that it was a harsh environment for those early settlers, and that there was no economy that came out of that land when it became the state of Israel, and that created somewhat of a firestorm here in British Columbia, certainly on Twitter and in media that was beyond the pale. But I think it's important to qualify that there was a target on my back much earlier than that. And so I believe, and others believe, that I was targeted partly because I'm a Jew, and partly because I was very clear as the Minister for Post-Secondary Education that one particular academic at one of our colleges who celebrated the massacre of October 7th, that I basically called her behavior vile and disgusting and inappropriate as an academic, and was glad to see that the institution had put her on leave and subsequently fired her. But that was when a target was put on my back.
So I just want to clarify, though. It's the words about the land that Israel occupied that was used against you. The marshland and the swamps that were cleared and hadn't been cleared until the Israeli settlers came.
Yes. Okay.
That
was the seminal or language that got turned into a meme, right? So it became this meme that said, crappy piece of land. What's really interesting is since then, I was just in Israel a couple of weeks ago, and with a group here from British Columbia, several non-Jews who wanted to come and see, and they did a little bit more of a tour than I did. They actually went down to the Dead Sea, they went to Masada, and they came back and they said, Selina, it really is a crappy piece of land. And I said, Israelis today would agree, and that that it is harsh, that it's mostly desert. At the time, Tel Aviv was mostly swamp,
yes.
and So it didn't matter whether or not it was what I said was true. Like that was irrelevant. It was that people got insulted by what I said. And that created some significant challenges for me. And I would say for the government, but unfortunately the government, I think, made the wrong decision, made the wrong choice.
So who felt insulted and why?
I can't speak to why they felt insulted. I did apologize that, my words hurt people. That's not what I was intending. Certainly not what I wanted. And so I wanted to understand what was harmful, like what hurt. And the response I did get back was, well, it implied somehow that the Palestinians who had been living there, somehow implying that only Palestinians live there. We know that Jews live there. We know that Christians live there. We know that Druze live there. We know that lots of different peoples lived there at the time, that somehow it implied that they were poor stewards of the land. And I was happy to qualify that actually it was the Ottomans that were poor stewards of the land, that they treated it as a backwater. They didn't invest in infrastructure. They ignored their responsibilities. But no one asked me to qualify my statement in any way, shape, or form, which I think speaks to the lack of public discourse that we have, that we've lost our manners. We've lost civility that once used to exist in our public discourse. And instead, the haters who were not interested in what I meant, were not interested in me qualifying or explaining myself. They were only interested in shutting me up and getting rid of me as a decision maker in the government.
So the fact that you implicitly denied the idea that the land was inhabited by the Palestinians, that it was Palestinian land. You denied that implicitly in your statement. That was what insulted Palestinians.
You know what, I can't speak for them, Evelyn, only because this is sort of the only snippet I got. I also want to say that, I did apologize, and I did agree that I would reach out to Muslims in general. I was accused of Islamophobia, even though I said nothing about Islam, which was also really troubling. But I said, I'm happy to take a course in Islamophobia. I'm eager to learn more about how I can make the world better for everybody who lives here in Canada. We are a very open society with tremendous diversity, people from all walks of life. I'm happy to learn more. And so I did make a number of phone calls to 3 Muslim community leaders here in British Columbia. I reached out to the Canadian Muslim Association, I'm thinking of the acronym, but it'll come to me. So I reached out to an organization that represents Muslims here in Canada. The 3 community leaders that I spoke to, they were lovely conversations. They were warm and inviting. We agreed that we should get together. Let's have conversations. My community, the Jewish community, is in agony. Your community is in agony. Let's come together and talk about how we can support each other. And this was before Ramadan, and I said, I was thrilled, and 2 of them said, can we get together for an iftar, for a fast dinner? And I said, it would be my honor, and I would love to reciprocate and maybe have you at a Seder. And we could do this over, over food. And I never heard from them again.
No. Yeah.
And the National Council for Canadian Muslims, that was the body that I spoke to. I had an appointed time to speak with them, like 3:00 on a Wednesday. I called them at 3:00. There was no answer, went to voicemail. I said, I'll call you back in half an hour in case you got caught up in something. I called again, I left another message, and I never heard from them. So I'm really deeply disappointed that these people who were calling for me to apologize, and they were so deeply insulted. I stepped into, okay, so how can I fix this? And I got nothing back. And that to me is very disappointing.
Yes, and that's what I have often heard. If you're dealing with Islamists, which means people who believe in Islamic dominance, then you are very welcome on Islamic celebrations or rituals, but the other way around is not what they want to do. I've heard that many times before, and I don't know. Do you know if you spoke with Muslims or Muslim organizations that can be considered Islamist?
I don't like, I haven't had that kind of experience. I will, at all. I do believe in reaching out to people from different communities, and I'm committed to doing that work. I said I would do that work and reaching out to these communities, and I've done that work, but I'm not getting anything back.
No.
So if we're going to have a relationship, it
Right.
needs to be mutual, and
Right.
it can't just be one way. And so I'm deeply disappointed because I was asked to reach out to them, and I did that. But they're
Right.
willing, they haven't reciprocated, they haven't participated. And I'm not going to make a global statement. I can't make a global statement about people. I'm not, that's not who I am. But I'm just deeply disappointed that I was accused of something. I wanted to make amends, but there's no interest in that. There's no, from these people, I'm not going to say more broadly, but these were people that were identified, that came to government and said, she needs to talk with us. Okay. But they're not, I didn't get back what I thought they were interested in. And so I don't know what to make of that, except to say that I'm deeply disappointed. And I think government, and this is where I'll come back to government. They thought this would be helpful, but it really isn't. And at the end of the day, government, I think, got seduced into doing something that I don't think anyone was really interested in. The people that were screaming about it were really not interested in fixing anything. They were only interested in getting rid of the Jew.
Yeah.
So tell us about how you were forced to resign from your ministry post.
So so when this all came to pass, like I did this panel discussion on the Tuesday, the clip started going viral by Wednesday, Thursday. Friday, I started to get, pretty anxious, and certainly heard from our premier, who is really in charge of government. Who is like a governor, I suppose, if I had to give it an American language. And he said, we've got your back. This thing is a concern. You should do an apology. So this was on the Friday. Government, the premier's office wrote the apology. I said, fine, like I don't agree that what I said wasn't wrong, but if it hurt people, so I said I will do all those things, because really, if I've insulted people, I want to fix it. I did a second apology, because apparently that wasn't enough. So I did a second apology very publicly, with tremendous humility. And then on Sunday night, there was supposed to be a fundraiser for the party. They had to cancel it because protests, just like we're seeing in the States, we were getting protests here as well. Paid protesters, we've sort of recognized.
Could you repeat that sentence again? I think it's very important.
Yeah, well,
protesters who are paid.
They're paid. They're paid. We know that they're paid. We know that there's an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic organization that's based here in British Columbia that is, connected to Hamas. We know that. The Canadian government allows them to continue to operate, and we know that they're paying protesters.
Wait, can you one more thing clarify? In Canada, has Hamas been declared a terrorist organization?
Yes. In Canada, they are declared a terrorist organization. We know that Samidoun operates here in Canada, and we know that they support Hamas. So there's a disconnect here. That's a problem here in Canada, and Samidoun's office is here in British Columbia. So they operate here. So we know that that's happening, and then we know that they're paid protests, and they flooded the hotel where our caucus was meeting on the Monday, Tuesday. And so the premier asked me to come to caucus to talk about my error in what I said.
Could you explain what you mean by caucus?
So caucus is the people that belong to our party that have been elected. We have a majority in government. So all the New Democrats At the time, there were 56 of us who we gathered together to talk about plans for the next session, for what we're going to be doing legislatively, and how we're going to operate as a group. And so I explained why I did the panel discussion that I did. I explained, how hard it is for me as a Jewish person, the only identified Jew in our caucus. I've always said I'm the Jew in the crew. And so anytime there was a Jewish anything, everyone turned to me, right? If the opposition, who asks questions of government, asked a Jewish question about why, are we adopting the IRA definition? Why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing that? If there was a Jewish anything happening, Yom HaShoah happening, or a Jewish holiday, Selina, is this the right graphic to go with this holiday? Like I was the Jewish consultant, the Jew in the crew, who made sure that the relationship with the Jewish community here in British Columbia, about 40,000 people in a population of 5.5 million, very, very small Jewish community. I was the liaison, right? So I had a very seminal role, but I had to explain to my colleagues why I agreed to be on this panel. I was, I would say, chastised or slapped on the wrist for even doing that, because our caucus had sort of felt that, given the October 7th massacre, which I led, I was the one who spoke on behalf of the Jewish community, on behalf of government. So I had a very strong role for the Jewish community, and making sure that the Jewish community knew that government understood the pain and was there with the Jewish community. And so really was put in this funny place of, be there for the Jewish community, but don't do anything Jewish. Don't somehow situate us, government, as aligning with Israel, because the Palestinian voices here are very strong as well. And the anti-Israel sentiment, which is strong in New Democrats, much like you have with your left-leaning representatives in the States, with, what do they call, the squad? We have those people here too in our party. And so it becomes this tightrope to walk. And I had done my best to walk the tightrope, but I was the only one walking the tightrope. No one else was walking the tightrope. Apparently my colleagues, the 55 of them, were pretty upset with me that I didn't walk the tightrope well enough. But nobody else had to walk the tightrope, only me. So
what do you mean? What do you mean they didn't have to walk the tightrope?
Sorry, what was that?
What do you mean by that? They didn't have to, they didn't have to walk the tightrope?
Because they weren't connected to the Jewish community. They weren't representing government to the Jewish community. But I was expected to. I was asked to. And so if I have to represent government to the Jewish community, but I can't ever talk about Israel, it's impossible. It's just an impossible task. So I spent 5 months, 4.5 months doing that tightrope. And, people were upset with me. So after that, of course, I hadn't eaten or slept for 3 or 4 nights. I was pretty rattled. And in the meantime, I was told, government has my back, Premier has my back. And then I got a phone call. I got a phone call that Monday afternoon from the Premier saying, Selina, I can't see a path forward. And I said, well, I'm not going to give my resignation, but if you ask for it, I will give it. And he said, I think you need to give it. And then he didn't want me to say that I was asked for my resignation. He wanted me to offer it. And I said, I can't do that. But the most I will give you is that it was a joint decision. And so it went out as a joint decision.
I still need to understand more why you should resign from your ministry post. That's the part that I, really don't understand.
I think the Premier wanted to keep his hands clean. He didn't want to be seen as the one to punish the Jewish woman, right? This was about him staying out of the fray. But if I offered it, then it's not his doing, right? But I was just like, no. So we did it as a joint. I thought, okay, we'll do it as a joint. And then, there was a reporter here who figured it out. Like, so first I wasn't going to resign. And then I did, like, what happened in the interim. And so she figured out, and I got these panic texts from people out of the premier's office. You better not be talking to the media. And it's just like, it felt a little bit crazy. And then they got the resignation. In the meantime, I got a death threat from someone in the States, actually, that required investigation from our police. Homeland Security investigated, FBI investigated. And so they put an alert on my house and on my office. And my family was freaked out. My husband was freaked out. We didn't know where it was coming from, of course, because it came in as an email. And we just decided to leave for a week. We took off as a family. And while I was away, of course, I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, I was pretty distressed. But I thought, what can I do? How can I be useful? How can I be useful to the Jewish community? And how can I? So I called the premier I was in Mexico, and I called him and I said, listen, I have this idea. What do you think about, we do some training collectively as a caucus, as New Democrats, anti-Islamophobia training, anti-Semitism training. I am well connected to the Jewish community. I'm going to do this outreach work to the Muslim community here. And I keep qualifying the Arab Muslim community, because I don't think Indonesian Muslims are impacted in the same way. It's a different community. How about I do some work to bring these communities together? We have to heal some way. And he said, well, that's an interesting idea. Let's think about it. And I came back. And so I was still in caucus. I was still part of the New Democrat Party. My office was at the front of our legislative buildings. And we have what's called a throne speech, which is the beginning of a session when government lays out its plan for the next session. And it's a big deal. And people come, lobbyists come, and people interested in government come, and it's full house. And there's often protests, people who are angry, with government. And I had to listen to protesters for that entire day, which is still hard to listen to, talk about freeing Palestine from the river to the sea. And it was slipping into strong anti-Semitism. 2 Jewish lobbyists who I know were coming in, and they felt unsafe walking into the People's House. We call it the People's House. None of my colleagues came to say, how are you? I know this must be hard to listen to. No one came to say, this has to be so hard. And that broke my heart. Like my heart really broke October 7th in many ways, but it was just like, how can you not hear these words as being hateful to me as a Jewish person? So, I went through the motions the month that I was there. So I stepped down early February. And then throughout that entire month, the premier's office sort of was like, tell us more about this project, this idea. And I did, and I fleshed it out a little bit. We have 2 national special envoys, one focusing on Islamophobia, one focusing on anti-Semitism. I have a relationship with the women who on anti-Semitism. I said, let's bring them in. They specialize in that. They can help as consultants to us. I fleshed that out, and I met with it was my birthday. I met with the premier. It was supposed to be the day that I said I wasn't going to run again, but it became the day that I quit caucus, because I went to meet with the chief of staff to the premier. And he said, well, we've thought about it, but we think it's too political. And in that moment, my heart just shattered. It shattered because as a government, we have a responsibility to take care of people. And we have 2 communities that are shattered, that are grieving. I grieve for the Palestinians who are losing family in Gaza. I think what's happening is horrible. And we need to be able to talk about it. And we need to be able to talk about it civilly and with compassion and empathy. And I know that there are people who are shattered by what happened on October 7th. and they need to be able to talk about it. And to have a government say that that's too political was like, this is not who I am, and this is not the government I signed up to be a part of. We have an election in October, and that if that's all you can think about, then you are not doing your jobs, and I don't want any part of it. And so I had a sense this was coming. And the weekend before, I had written a letter to my colleagues, and I made it public. It was a 5-page letter that talked about my experience over the months since October 7th, about how many of my colleagues over the years had made anti-Semitic comments, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist comments, that Israel is pinkwashing, that that there really isn't a freedom to be gay, that Israel is, a colonialist state that suppresses, Muslim voices, Palestinian voices, like just those sorts of comments. And when they get called out, typically by the Jewish community, they've apologized. They've apologized, or they've made, Zionist, use the Holocaust to portray, frustration with another group. Like, it's like, no, you don't get to use the Holocaust for these purposes, right? And they've apologized, and the Jewish community has always, always, always accepted their apologies. But my apology wasn't sufficient. And it's that double standard. And even though, really, I don't think I said anything terrible, but if it hurt people, I'm prepared to apologize for hurting people, and I want to understand how not to do that ever again. But that wasn't acceptable, and to my colleagues, and that's anti-Semitism.
And so you left your party and became an independent. Is that
Yeah.
correct? You're running as
Yeah.
an independent for re-election in.
I'm not running for re-election. No. I had decided to not run for re-election back. My husband will divorce me. I had decided back in December that I wasn't running again. And this is the other thing that's really interesting, because our premier has said, if I had known how troubled and how hard this is for her, I had told him in December, when I told him that I wasn't running for re-election, and he said he was surprised because I did love my job. And I was good at it. I think I was very good at it. That I felt that caucus for me wasn't the same since October the 7th, that things had changed for me. And so, I'm not running again in October. Like, I'll do my job. And I said, and please, like, I want to keep my file. And he said, oh, absolutely. You keep your file. You're good at it. So that was it. That was a conversation in December. And then, 6 weeks later, I was out. I was out because I had done this terrible thing. And I had deep work to do. And I say that with tremendous contempt, because I actually think the deep work is what he needs to do and what the caucus needs to do. They do not see the anti-Semitism. They just do not see it. And that's problematic. And when I suggested that we all do anti-Semitism training, we all do anti-Islamophobia training, there was zero appetite. And that to me is disgusting.
I commend you for your
Clarification.
fight. For your fight.
Sorry, I missed that, Evelyn.
I commend you for your fighting back.
Thank you.
And another question as we talk about this, is Holocaust education mandatory in British Columbia?
It is now, so that's a story as well. The work to make Holocaust education mandatory. People are shocked that it never has been. It's always been an optional curriculum. Sorry, don't mind Rio, therapy dog here. Okay, Rio. We had been working on that since 2017, when we formed government. That work had been in the works. Of course, COVID sort of derailed it as people had to pivot their energies. And it got picked up again. And I picked it up, not the Minister of Education. I picked it up because a woman here in British Columbia wrote this great book called Kiss of the Red Stare, which is a great book. It's a book by her about her parents, they're Holocaust survivors, Kiss of the Red Stare. And it is a fabulous book by Marcia Lederman, Lederman. I highly recommend it. I read it in June and I called her. I put out on Twitter that I love the book and I reached out to her and I said, Marcia, and she's a journalist for the Globe and Mail. And I said, Marcia, this book is so good. It reminds me that we need to pick up this work. I'm going to make it happen. And I called the premier and I called the Minister of Education and we pushed it. And when October 7th happened, I said, now's the time to make it happen. The Jewish community needs to know, and this is something we can do. And so ever since then, when we talk about anti-Semitism or a question is asked by government about what they're doing, they said, oh, well, we're doing mandatory Holocaust education. That's our response to October 7th. And I said, no, that was our response to, to dealing with racism in general and making sure that there's never, a genocide again and helping people understand what happened. But we started doing that work in 2017. It is not in response to October 7th. And you can't use that as, look how good we are. And it won't start until September 2025. So how is that going to deal with the rise in anti-Semitism we are seeing on our streets today? And I just came back from our parliament buildings yesterday and I asked the question again about what government's doing around the rise in anti-Semitism. And they had nothing really to say. They are doing work around anti-racism, and it's work that they've started in 2017, and it's good work. I don't want to say that it's not good work, but the bills that they're proposing are very much around people of color and not Jews or Muslims, because we can be people of color or not. Our identities are wrapped up differently, and they don't seem to understand that. That's a problem.
Would you educate us a bit about the numbers? How big is the Jewish community in British Columbia, and how big is the Muslim community there?
So the Jewish community is about 40,000 here in British Columbia, and it's somewhat spread out. While most of it is located in Vancouver, which is the biggest city here in the West Coast, that's about 5.5 million people. The Muslim community is much larger. I don't have the numbers, but I could say it's much larger, and it's much more diverse. It's made up of people from India, from Indonesia. Certainly from the Middle East, from all parts of the Middle East, and it's quite varied. We also have, different kinds of Muslims, right? So that plays out, differently as well. We also have a lot of folks who are Sikh, who are who seem to, from my experience, see themselves and see the struggle of Palestinians as similar to their struggle for a Khalistani state. So that's part of what is being picked up in terms of allyship, I'll characterize it. And because people don't know Jewish history, it becomes this thing where they think that, Israel has always been, a strong country in the way that they perceive it now. And so I think what I find frustrating is that some people are taking positions, not all people are taking positions. Most British Columbians just don't want the conflict there to be here. So we know that 70% of British Columbians are like, it's far away. Why is this an issue that's in our face here? And I appreciate that. I mean, I read the news. What's happening in Darfur is horrifying. What's happening in Sudan, 30 million people are going to die of starvation in Sudan, and no one is talking about it. The Uyghurs, the Muslim Uyghurs, their oppression against China is outrageous. And no one is talking about them. So why are you talking about this? I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, but
No, we
why is it
understand.
getting so much attention? Well, there's Jews. It's those Jews. And that's the only the only thing I can come up with. So the only other explanation, and I have heard a counter explanation, and I think it's only fair to share it, is that in Gaza, there's everyone has phones and everyone has internet. And so they're able to push out a lot of information. In Darfur and the Uyghurs and in Sudan, there isn't that sort of infrastructure in order to push out information. And so it isn't getting the kind of airtime that it deserves. But I also know that we're talking about educated people, people who read newspapers, people who have access to these stories. And I too want justice for all of these people. I want justice for everybody. But the obsession, it's the obsession
Yes.
that is a problem. And why aren't we talking about the obsession? And I think, to me, that's anti-Semitism.
I think that you actually, that's why I wanted you to emphasize the paid obsession, paid protests, because no one that I can tell is paying for people to protest in the United States about not paying attention to Darfur, etc. But they're paying people to protest about Gaza. And I think that this is, how should I say this? I was discussing with my husband this morning. It's really a huge, huge threat to American and therefore also Canadian democracy that people don't understand. If you can allow
I agree.
paid, what is it called? The fifth column is probably what I'm talking about, to influence your politics in the United States. Why not the next time bring down America? And in this case, it's both.
And it's through Western, right? It's through all the Western democracies. So this is the part, and I do agree with you that I think we do need to have conversations about how we protect democracy. And my being fired is part of threat to democracy, right? I was duly elected by the people that I represent in my suburban community here in British Columbia, 55,000 people. They asked me 3 times to be the representative. Each time my vote count went up, they like me. And people here have been, in my community, have been so generous with love. I'm getting heart emojis as I walk in the park. They do one of these, because they feel for me. They are devastated that I've been fired. They feel devastated for me. There were swastikas and killed Jews on a bus stop in my community just as I was preparing for Pesach. Someone sent to me. And I don't have a lot of Jews in my community, very few Jews here in my suburban community. And people are horrified. They're horrified for me. They're horrified for the Jewish community. And they're horrified that our democracy has been seconded, has been usurped by these paid folks who are faux outrage. And I got fired. And now Jews are saying, why would I run for office?
And you're the third member of, you're the third representative of the people that we had in our show that has Jewish, that has resigned in the past few months, or in one before that. 2 in the UK we had in the show, and you now from British Columbia. 3 Jews.
Well, actually, Mike, the UK one isn't Jewish. He represented a very Jewish constituency.
The second one,
yes. But very pro Israel, etc. Yes.
Yeah.
He also.
Yeah. So again, I mean, I am urging Jewish people to run, and to run for the party that was my party. I always say that there's no party of perfect fit. Doesn't exist. It's always a party of best fit. And so I still see myself as a progressive. The other parties, I don't like their positions on many things. So this is still, but the party changed and the leadership changed. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think there needs to be a reckoning with the party around this. But I also believe that Jewish people need to be in all parts of life, in all parts of civil society. And if we step back, that is bad for all of us. And so I do continue to urge Jewish people to run, but we have to have their back. We have to have their back. We have to develop allies. So I've been reaching out, for example, to indigenous leaders. So there were indigenous leaders that also wanted me out. And I, for the life of me, couldn't figure out how it is that indigenous leaders, our First Nations peoples here in British Columbia, they too align themselves. They see themselves aligned with Palestinian people because of the colonial framework here in Canada, which is similar to the United States. And we've been doing a lot of work on reconciliation here in British Columbia, and I'm so proud of the work that we've done, and proud of the work that I have done to right historic wrongs. But they have aligned themselves with Palestinian voice, not knowing the history of the land, not knowing the history of the Jewish people, of being thrown out of their land, but always having a presence on the land, much like they've always had a presence on the land, not appreciating our origin story of Moses wandering through the desert to the promised land and their origin stories that they have about these lands. They don't see the parallels there. They have said the fact that they're living on what they consider reserve, right? That the Palestinians have been moved to reserve without knowing the history. And we too have a reservation system, much like you have in the States. Again, they align themselves. And so they too were calling for my head. They're politicians. Indigenous leaders are politicians. And again, I'm outraged that they would weigh in on a conflict that they know nothing about, but have decided to align themselves without understanding the history. And I think that's so disrespectful to Jews. I think it's anti-Semitic. And I do think there's a lot of work for us to do on the ground to help educate these folks about who we are, right? Who we are. We're 16 million, maybe, strong globally. And that is such a small minority, but we live everywhere. We live everywhere, and we can't hide. And I worry that this recent round of hate is making us want to turn inward, be self-protected. And I think that is bad for us. And I think it's bad for civil society to do that.
Evelyn, do you have a last question before we come to an end of this really, really compelling interview?
Is there something you think we can do to turn around the rapid rise of anti-Semitism, in this case at the left, in these times?
Yeah, it's on the left. I sort of joke that the right sees us as not white enough, and the left sees us as too white. It's so it's and I actually saw this coming in the 90s. Actually, I'm a family therapist by training, and there was a lot of identity politics starting in the 90s. And I remember a time when we were said, well, people of color need to have their own space to do, their dialogue about what that feels like. And, and white people need to stay out. And I'd say, well, I'm white by skin, but I have a different experience as a Jew. Where do I go? And they looked at me like I was crazy. What do you mean there's a different Jewish experience? And that was in the early 90s. And so this has been coming for a long time, I think. So I think there's a lot that we need to do. I think we can't be afraid. I know that it's fearful. I know that many of us feel fearful, but we can't be afraid. I think we need to continue to do the work. I think we need to continue to pursue allies. People come to me as the Jew in the crew, and I proudly wear my Jewish identity. I light the Shabbat candles. I post it on Facebook. I do prayers. I do Jew, and I'm not going to back down. It's too important to me. And so I think we need to find the allies, educate the allies. And people come to me and say, Selina, there's this piece of graffiti that you need to know about. It's like, no, I am not going to report it. You are going to report it. This is how you report it. We don't, when there's queer hate, we don't go call the nearest queer person that we know and say, you need to report this. So why would you do that to a Jewish person? And they go, oh my God, I didn't realize I was doing that. So we need to educate people about what you do when you come across that. We need to find our allies. We need to help them understand. We need to educate them. There are so many allies out there, and we have, I think, a responsibility to engage them, to educate them, to give them the tools and the confidence to act. Because I think a lot of times the silent majority are just afraid to say the wrong thing. So we need to help them feel confident to do that. I'm not going to spend time on the haters, frankly. That's too painful for me. And I will leave that to other people to do. But I really am pursuing the allies and want to engage with those folks so that they have the confidence to do what we all need them to do. And we always say, you know, it might start with the Jews, but it won't end with the Jews. So it is really incumbent on everybody to take a stand and to push back on the hate.
That's such an important message that I promised to give you last words, but unless you want to add something, those last words are very, very powerful. It's incumbent upon all of us to speak up. That's what Evelyn and I started this show about. It'll be almost 3 years in a couple of months because we wanted to encourage people to speak up.
Well, kol hakavod, I think it's important work, and I really appreciate you doing this work.
We appreciate what you're doing. And thank you so much for coming on the show. We really, you've been invaluable in explaining things and hopefully encouraging others to take the path that you've taken.
Yes.
So I
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.
I thank
Thanks for having me.
We thank our listeners. For those of you who want to know more about Evelyn and myself and our work, you can go to Never Again Is Now podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And always, as we end each episode, we say, please speak up against anti-Semitism and all hate.